we go.
Yeah.
There we go. All right.
There we go.
All these, I've been going between Teams, WebEx, and Zoom, and sometimes I can't remember where the buttons are. Okay. Well, hello, everybody. Very happy to be able to talk to you about risk today. First, a little bit my background. First of all, my name is Matthew Rafelson, and I am the Finance and Risk Management Lead for Level 4 Consulting. My background is actually as a CFO. I has 25 years Chief Finance Officer experience in financial services for a $30 billion revenue line of business. And in addition to finance and accounting, I had the strategic planning functions and data science. And we did lots and lots of risk decision-related modeling. Since then, I have also been a director at the not-for-profit called probabilitymanagement.com, which focuses on the arithmetic of uncertainty for chance-informed decisions. So all of this comes together very nicely. For the last couple of years, I've been doing work with the California Department of Energy Safety and also the CPUC, all around risk decision framework. And what I'd like to talk to you about is where I see the future of risk-based decision making going. All right. So I'll cover three topics: a definition of risk, or risk, what is it? Reducing risk and accepting risk. And you'll see on each page some of these icons, so you'll know if I'm talking about definitions, philosophy. Surprisingly, maybe to some, that risk is a very philosophical and conceptual topic, and it's worth going into that a little bit to get a better understanding. But we'll also be getting practical and going into some brass tacks. Okay, so starting with risk, what is it? If you Google it, you'll come across hundreds of definitions, and most of them have, very academic or flowery language. I like this one, the chance of something bad happening, because that's the essence of it. Those 5 or 6 words. It's the chance of something bad happening. From a philosophical sense, it's important to realize that risk is in the eye of the beholder. There is no standard or pure definition of what a risk is for everybody. And an example of that is, many of you might be worried about the risk of the stock market going down. Well, unless you're a short seller, in which case your risk is if the stock market goes up. In climate terms, the growing number of champagne and other wine growers in the United Kingdom probably have a very different view of climate risk than the coffee growers of Central America. Mm-hmm. So it's important to see that not everybody's going to see risk the same way. And then a sort of practical expression of risk, so that you can start doing math with it, is that risk is the likelihood of something bad happening multiplied by the consequence of that bad event, or risk equals the likelihood of risk event, which we sometimes call LOR, times the consequence of risk event, or CORE. Okay, reducing risk. Some definitions, very important. Inherent risk. Inherent risk is the level of risk before mitigations are applied. So think of that's your starting point of risk. Risk reduction is the impact of all your risk mitigations. Then residual risk is the level of risk after your mitigations. So it's what the risk that you end up with. And then attributes, we typically divide risk up into components, and in California utility land, those are safety risk, reliability risk, and financial risk. Conceptually, trade-offs are very important when considering risk. And the typical trade-offs that we have to deal with are safety versus reliability, the cost of lower risk versus affordability, and then, how risk impacts current versus future generations. Practically speaking, the way we deal with these trade-offs and other risk calculations is with the cost-benefit approach. Benefits are the monetized is monetization of risk reduction. Costs are the cost of risk reduction. And then the benefit cost ratio, or BCR, is simply the benefits divided by the costs. Okay, so now we will go through an actual simple numerical example so that everyone's on the same page. Let's assume that our inherent risk, based on our risk models, machine learning, artificial intelligence, whatever we're using, is we estimate that the likelihood of risk is 10%, and the consequence of this risk is 2 million. Then risk is the product of those two, 10% times 2 million, or 200,000. Now let's further suppose our mitigation plan will reduce the likelihood of risk by 80%. Then your risk reduction is now 8%, and you multiply that by the 2 million of core, and your risk reduction is 160,000. So if you subtract your risk reduction from your inherent risk, your residual risk now is 2% of likelihood times the 2 million of consequence equals 40,000. This is the standard approach now for doing the risk calculations. Here I chose a mitigation that just impacted the lore. It is possible to have mitigations that impact core, or both lore and core, but the math is the same. Okay, so schematically, when you start with your inherent risk, you take your mitigations, here mitigation 1, 2, and 3, and they sum up to a risk reduction, and you're left over with a level of residual risk. Fair enough. Okay, now, we did not specify units. I tried to slip that over on you. So I said 2 million. I didn't tell you what the 2 million was. How is it, does the 2 million represent some level of, lives and lost and serious injuries, or is it some, power interrupted minutes? The cost of property damage, we didn't say, but it becomes important to say, and that's where trade-offs come in. So you have the safety versus reliability trade-off. In California, I think many of us are familiar with PSPS, or public safety power shutoff, where sure, the utility can guarantee 100% safety. We just shut off the power every time the wind exceeds 15 miles an hour. Well, how do you weigh that against thousands or hundred thousands of people without power for 2 days? Another important trade-off is the affordability trade-off. We know that reducing risks, such as wildfire risk, will reduce deaths and serious injuries. However, we also know that there is an inverse relationship between incomes and mortality. In other words, when you reduce incomes, mortality increases, and higher energy costs reduces incomes. So how do you make that trade-off? And then there's the intertemporal trade-off. Many of the most effective mitigations take years, even decades, to become operational. During that period, the current generation is not protected against the risk. So how do you trade off reducing risk for future generations, but keeping the current generation at risk? This is where the practical aspects of the cost-benefit approach come in. Let's talk about what that looks like. So mitigation A, hypothetical. Mitigation A saves 10 lives and reduces interruption events by 10,000. Well, we also have mitigation B, which saves 0 lives, but reduces interruption events by 1 million. What do you do? Well, the cost-benefit approach assigns monetization values two of them that apply to this one are VSL, which is the value of a statistical life, which is about $15 million. Where did that come from? Well, that's what the U.S. Department of Transportation, or DOT, comes up with. And by the way, they have a whole book on various monetization values that can be used in cost benefit. For reliability, there's something called the cost per event in the interruption cost estimator, ICE, which is developed by the Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory in California. That's also commonly used. So we can use these monetization values, and mitigation one then becomes 10 lives times 15 million plus 10,000 events times $150. Well, that mitigation benefit is 151.5 million. We can do the same for mitigation two, and we see that that calculates to 150 million. Let's assume for simplicity, these two mitigation options cost the same, so that it becomes clear that mitigation A would be ranked first, which then leads to something called the BCR, which we talked about earlier, the benefit cost ratio. Let's assume that the mitigation that we talked about costs $100 million. Well, the benefit is 151 million. The costs are 100 million. So your BCR is 1.5. And a starting decision rule is if the BCR is greater than 1, which means the benefits exceed the cost, you would accept that project. Notice I put a big red asterisk there. The BCR greater than 1 is not the only decision rule you can have. It's not the only viable decision rule. There are other rules that are based on risk attitude and budget limitations. And we will be addressing the topic of risk attitude in just a little bit. So let's go through a risk reduction example using the concepts we've introduced. So we start out with our schema, and let's say inherent risk is 1 billion, and mitigation one has a benefit of 500 million. It costs 100 million. CBR is 5. Well, that's much better than 1, so that's a no-brainer. We're going to keep it simple, and these are going to be cumulative mitigations. So then you add a second mitigation, and now your benefit is up to 800 million, your cost is 400 million, and your CBR is 2. And well, if we add a third mitigation, we can reduce risk to 0. So we have a benefit of 1 billion, the cost is 800 million, CBR is still greater than 1. So, what's to talk about? Well, wait a minute. I didn't give you some important information. What were the impact of energy rates? Well, for the first round of mitigations, 15%. All right. Second round, 60% increase in energy costs. Oh, to reduce all the risk, now impact on energy costs goes up to more than doubles. How do you decide? Well, right now we're kind of in a state of chaos, because different people will, decide differently on, well, what can we afford? How much risk should we do? And the real question is, how much risk do we really need to eliminate? Or said another way is, can we really increase energy costs by a factor of 2.2? And at the end of the day, can we live with a certain amount of risk and not have to make extremely painful trade-offs? This leads us into our third topic, which is the notion of accepting risk. And I have here kind of my variation on an old Irish saw. If you don't know where you want to go, you probably wouldn't want to start from here, which introduces risk tolerance. The definition of risk tolerance is the maximum amount of risk a decision maker or stakeholder, pretty much anybody, is willing to accept. And the word maximum here is important. This is the most risk that you can tolerate. Important concepts: average risk versus tail risk, risk attitudes, we introduced it a little bit before, the probabilistic nature, and finally, exactly whose tolerance are we talking about here? And the practical aspects are some decision rules and how to establish the risk tolerance. Okay, taking these one at a time. Tail risk. This is a very, very important concept that we are, in working with the state, really getting our hands around. First of all, we can think of risk as a probability distribution. This distribution, that big curve, is known to statisticians as a log normal distribution, and you can see it has a very distinctive shape. The top of the curve, where the probability is high, that's where most of your risk events are going to happen, and in this case, are fairly modest, or can be around 50, call it $50 million there. However, you start to have a ever decreasing amount, but non-zero, of number of very high extreme events. And so you can see here, there is some probability of having events 200, 300, and I think the tail probably goes up to 400 or 500. This is called the tail. It looks like a tail. So it's very conveniently called tail risk. And the point that we want to make is saying, using a single number here, saying 100 is a good representative of this risk is just wrong and dangerous. You can't sit here thinking that this is, I can live with 100, when in fact you might be living with 200, 300, 400 or more. And as the Nicholas Nassim Taleb, who wrote the book The Black Swan, said, what matters is not the average, but the presence of extreme events. Okay, so let's go into this concept of tail risk a little bit more, and we're going to make this a little bit more personal. And I want you all to follow along with me as we go through this. I'm not going to call on anybody to say, well, what was your answer? But keep your own tabs. Here's the deal. The God risks out there like to flip coins, and they have told you that, well, you're facing a potential risk, and if we flip tails, you're going to have to pay $2,000. That's your risk. If you flip heads, well, you got lucky and you are able to skirt the risk and you pay nothing. All right. So your local insurance broker comes to you and says, listen, I can, make the $2,000 piece of this go away for you, but you're gonna have to pay me something. Well, how much would you be willing to pay to make that 50% chance of 2,000 go away? Oh, by the way, introducing a term, expected value. The expected value of this risk, or also known as the average, is 1,000. So, would you be willing to pay 1,000, or less than 1,000, or more than 1,000 to make that 2,000 go away? Think about that, because it's important. We have names for this. They're called risk attitudes. If you're risk neutral, you are willing to pay the expected value to mitigate your risk. That's also a BCR equals 1. So I'm trying to tie all these concepts together. If you are risk averse, you have a preference for lower risk over higher risk, even if it means accepting a lower EV. That means you're willing to pay more than the 1,000 to not have to end up with possibly paying 2,000. By the way, just so you know that the entire insurance industry exists because of risk aversion. Buying insurance is always a negative EV proposition. Why? Because the insurance company makes a profit, and that profit is your negative EV. Mm-hmm. Okay. Or you can be risk seeking. That's a preference for higher risk over lower risk if it means a higher EV or benefit. And that means you would not be willing to pay $1,000 to avoid a 50% chance risk of 2,000. You might be willing to pay something, but not $1,000. Okay, so that's a fairly simple example. in a binary world. The world is not binary. There's a much more full probability distribution of risks. And this table starts to build that out. So here's that same expected value of $1,000. And this is under a risk attitude of risk neutrality. And you can see what that means is, okay, 10% chance of $10,000 risk, or a 1% chance of 100,000, or a 0.01%, which is 1 in 10,000 chance of 10 million. If you're risk neutral, those are all the same to you. You are indifferent to that. Now, some people might say a $10 million risk, I don't care if it's only a 1 in 10,000 chance. I can't sleep at night knowing that that's out there. That person might be risk averse, and they might be saying, you know what, at a 1 in 10,000 chance, I might be able to accept a $400,000 risk. Why? I could take out a second mortgage on my home and pay for that risk, but 10 million, no way. Well, now that's how risk averse person would think. And you can take this table and graph it, and it looks like this. And so you can see the probabilities, the 100, the 10%, the 1% so far on the y-axis, the consequence on the x-axis, and we drew the curve. And you can see I highlighted the points that were in yellow on the prior page. Your 10% risk of 800,000 is on the curve, and your 0.01% risk of 400,000 is also on the curve, as well as the other points. So what does that mean? Well, any risk that's to the right is in the unacceptable risk zone. You cannot accept that. Any risk to the left is within your acceptance. And this, in fact, is a risk tolerance curve. It's also known as risk tolerance exceedance curve, because it's basically saying this is the maximum amount of risk you're willing to accept. So this is a very handy thing to have if you've thought it through, because we now can take a risk and apply it to your risk tolerance. So let's say your models have come out with this risk in orange, and it's also probabilistic. It has, whatever the risk is at the consequence at 10%, 1%, and so on. And in this case, you can see it at lower levels of risk, or even down to about 1%, the risk is in the tolerable zone. But up once you get down to 0.01% and lower, it breaches the curve and is in the intolerable, unacceptable zone. Very useful to have, because if this is your risk tolerance, you're going to say, I cannot accept the risk at these low probabilities, and I will have to mitigate them. And whether that's to up your insurance or do other things that either lower the line or bend the line, well, that's what mitigation strategies do. So at the end of the day, this is where we want to get. We want to be able to do a risk assessment and compare it to a risk tolerance, and that will tell us how much more risk we need to mitigate and help us make the difficult trade-offs that we were outlining before. Okay, so now, whose risk tolerance are we talking about? Are we talking about shareholders of the utilities, or the legal and compliance community, including regulators? I can tell you their risk tolerances are very different. Shareholders are likely to be somewhat risk-seeking. By that's the nature of being a shareholder. Legal and compliance professionals tend to be very risk-averse. Mm-hmm. We have the residents of California, other stakeholders. Our position really is that the risk tolerance should represent the residents of California, if you're in California. And with input from these other constituents. How do you get that? Well, basically duke it out. We envision a process, a very public process, and a very inclusive process where the risk tolerance and the trade-offs are explicitly discussed and then worked out. And there's ways to moderate meetings like this to get people on the same page and to resolve differences. But ultimately, this is what we expect to happen, especially in the utility environment and wildfire risk in the state of California, but also other risks. So to summarize this, and I've gone over it, covered a lot of ground very quickly. Risk is the chance of something bad happening. And by the way, chance is just a simple word for probability. Risk management requires using the entire probability distribution, not just single numbers. We care about tail risk as well as average risk. And finally, risk-based decisions require understanding inherent risk, mitigation benefit and cost, residual risk, risk tolerance, and how all of these relate to each other. So everybody, that is a very quick and high-level overview of where we see the risk decision framework going in California. A lot of work need to be done. A lot of the details need to be worked out. And now I think we have some time for what questions you may have.
So thank you, Matthew and Sam. Also, I see you on the phone for that presentation. It's actually pretty apt with some of the proceedings that are currently happening at the California Public Utility Commission. Anybody want to pop up with a question, or you're also welcome to put questions in the chat box. And maybe as we're doing it, Kelsey, go ahead and pop up my presentation and we'll kind of continue to float through. Can you guys stay on a bit, or what's your timing of things?
I could stay on for a couple minutes and be a little late. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, are you going to do a question? Then we're going to have questions on this, or are we done with this one? And I can.
Yeah, you should get that over to Kelsey, and she'll put up the next presentation. And while she's doing that, yeah, does anybody have any? And actually, this photo here is maybe apt to your presentation. I don't know, but does anybody have any questions that they want to pose at this stage? So we appreciate your presence here. Stay on as long as you can, and things
Yeah, we'll do.
Yep. So really, the start of my presentation, and I acknowledge that I often put on weird photos on my presentation, and I apologize for the ones that don't work. They're not meant to suggest anything other than amusement. We're entering into kind of an uncertain period at a lot of different levels. We may have been there for quite a while. But because of changes in the federal administration, we're looking at several things that might happen that could impact California in the energy arena. It may be that the state's going to have to backfill some federal budget cuts. All of this is speculative, right? We don't know. It may be that the federal government will dial back on electric vehicle tax credits and such like that. And it may be that climate change will become less of a priority globally, in which case California is somewhat more isolated and in the position of having to fight a two-front climate war, actually managing wildfires and the consequences of extreme temperatures, and trying to work our way into a decarbonized environment. So I thought that was an important context to put on the table, because I believe that's going to start drifting and influencing a number of activities, regulatory, policy, legislative, and the governor, and how they approach climate change, equity issues, energy affordability, and the like. So if you go to the next slide, and people, please feel free to jump in with a question or a comment at any time. A few weeks ago, the governor issued this executive order. This is just a piece of the executive order. It is focused on affordability and sort of the sense that electric rates in California are becoming increasingly not affordable. And it directs the California Energy Commission and the California Public Utilities Commission to examine ways to address affordability. What kind of got the attention of those, particularly in the distributed energy resources and energy efficiency fields, as well as solar advocates, is that it pointed to certain elements of things that are maybe lurking allegedly behind affordability issues. One is net energy metering. which we know has already been corrected by the commission in NEM 3.0. It speaks to upgrading and expanding its critical work. And then it asks the legislature to look at prioritizing cost-effective programs and efficient programs. Go to the next slide. And then this smaller type. But it's to ask the commission to examine ratepayer funding programs specifically and maybe get them off the bill and kind of sets a cost-benefit framework. It's trying to do this very quickly. And by early January or sometime in January, expects to have a report on these issues. Before going to the next slide, I see Mark has a question. Ratepayer program. Well, so that's an interesting question, which let's talk about toward the end of the presentation, as it's kind of a global question. If you go to the next slide, at the same time, the solar advocates, and I have to acknowledge that it was my business partner, Rich McCann, who is the lead author of the report, are kind of doing a counterattack on the narrative that it is rooftop solar that it caused a lot of cost shifting. The original study by the Public Advocates Office asserted or estimated a cost shift of $8.5 billion to non-solar customers in 2024 because of the structure of NEM and rooftop solar. But Richard and my firm M Cubed actually found that it entirely swung the other way, saving ratepayers $2.3 billion in 2024. If you go to the next slide, and some of you have seen Richard's presentation on prior CivicWell or LGSEC related presentations. This is what is asserted as being the necessary cost, the corrections to the public advocates cost shift estimate. Hard to really tell exactly to look at this, but the bottom line is some of these have to do with the perspective one takes about who gets to own the value of the solar energy that's produced. The advocates report essentially makes the claim that the value is owned by the utility, and it's owned by the utility at the retail cost. So if the solar was not on the rooftop, then the utility would have garnered and gone to revenue, the rate base, that entire value at retail rates, and they would have captured that. And because they didn't, that's a cost shift. The alternative perspective is that actually value should be captured by the rooftop solar customers, and they're under no obligation to pay the utility the full retail rate. And the analogy Richard likes to use is that you don't have to pay Whole Foods price for the tomatoes that you grow in your garden. There are a number of other corrections that Richard made, including counting the care subsidy that was avoided as a result of people putting on rooftop solar, and also some of the transmission and distribution value of rooftop solar. The advocates did not account for reductions in transmission demand that were created by rooftop solar or distribution. So this is just to say this is an active debate. As part of the conversation, I circulated to I think everybody on this call, a letter that's being drafted or led by Marin Clean Energy around the governor's order, calling for a kind of a structured process to examine, particularly related to energy efficiency, how to go about addressing the issues within the governor's order. And people are, of course, invited to sign on that or not, or comment on it. So that's kind of been a big issue amongst advocates of a certain nature, and I wanted to put that on the table as it's in the atmosphere and will kind of be ongoing. If you go to the next slide, if there's any questions on that issue, please let me know or raise it in the chat room. So this gets to one of the proceedings that we've been engaged in. This is the energization proceeding. As we've discussed in lots of prior calls, kind of quick energization is important to local governments. It's important for economic development reasons. If commercial businesses, industrial businesses can't get energized, then it's retarding economic growth and ability to do business. If government agencies can't do the same, it also foils their plans for whatever it is, resiliency or the ability to put on a distributed generation project at a lower cost. the commission rendered a decision. We were part of the proceeding in which that decision was made, that the utilities need to essentially have the amount of time they take to energize and report on the progress that they're making in doing that. Seems like a good thing. But immediately PG&E filed for a very significant increase in what's called this capital cost cap in order to be able to achieve the energization goals. In some ways, quite reasonable, right? Like, you're asking us to do things faster. Well, we're going to need more money to do those things. Where we were troubled, we being LGSEC and the regulatory team, were troubled was that and we discussed this when we were originally involved in this proceeding, the original commission order about energization did not make any distinctions between the priorities and cost consequences of energization. And this actually gets at the level 4 presentation. There was no risk assessment made, and there was no expected value equation developed for different types of things that might need to be energized and the associated consequences of doing or not doing that. So a cannabis farm or a server farm, a data center is treated essentially the same in the commission order. There's no distinction between that and a new fire station, a hospital, a new laboratory developing biotechnology. They're all kind of lumped into the same way. So there's no way of understanding whether or not this money is going to be prioritized in a way that is actually going to achieve effective social outcomes. I participated in the pre-hearing conference to discuss this proposal by PG&E to increase their cost caps. There was keen interest by the administrative law judge in whether or not this would achieve environmental justice goals, whether the more rapid energization order would achieve that. My comment was, well, we don't know, because we don't know how this money is going to be spent. Both the public advocates in turn were pretty strongly opposed to this proceeding as fast as it's being proposed. But everybody on that side of the table lost. The commission issued an order this morning laying out a schedule for this proceeding at which intervener comments are due December 2nd, which means that there isn't really going to be an intervener. We're not going to be involved because that's just that we don't have an ability to move that fast. I doubt that the advocates or turn are going to be able to put on a case that fast either. The decision is supposed to be made in early January. So we're talking about a process that goes straight through the holidays and gets done. Kind of a signal by the commission that they're going to approve this in some fashion. Next slide or next topic. We just have a handful of things I'm going over, all of which have to do with risk. This is another very risk-related proceeding that has exactly to do with outages and the value of outages. We had a working group meeting on this last week to discuss it. I know it's very small type here, but the bottom line is that the commission is asking how reporting around outages and reliability issues, what new information is needed in order to get a decent understanding of how the utilities are doing with this, how they're doing with reliability. There is no consideration, again, of the cost consequences of different methods. The commission is solely focused in this case on the type of data and the way the data should be presented. And they're also, they are focused in terms of nuance around equity issues, not around other issues like maybe economic development issues or value of the issues, or even really resiliency that much. We are, LGSEC is going to participate in this proceeding in draft comments. And I think our comments are going to focus on making sure, and this is from some of the feedback from LGSEC members at the working group meeting, that we pay attention to not just the average, but what happens on the fringes, what happens a few standard deviations away from the average, and that we develop a better understanding of the consequences of reliability disruptions in terms of the wider ecosphere of resiliency that's available or not available to people, so that there is a whole host of data beyond just outages on a circuit that we need to know in order to understand where investments should be made and of what kind. And you're welcome to participate in the working group or in our comments on this proceeding if you're so moved. Any questions, or we'll go to the next slide, or comments? Indeed, it's a service capacity group. Maybe go to the next slide. So this is we have a couple more. I have a couple more slides about affordability. So this is just sort of tracking PG&E rates since 2023. So you'll notice that, I mean, it's a bit of an, over that time period, a 20% increase is rather alarming. But there is some silver lining, I suppose, or moderating news, is that rates did peak, kind of earlier this year, peak for the moment, and then kind of drifted back downwards and stabilized. A lot of the increase occurred mostly in 2023 into the beginning of 2024, and there seems to be a kind of a moderation. This is not necessarily an expectation, though, what happens next year. And we talked about this before. One of the problems and challenges of tracking rate increases, and I've had presented some rate information in a prior meeting, is that you don't really know exactly what it looks like until the utility files what's called an advice letter, that is an update and a formalization of a commission approval for some kind of investment that the utility is now going to make, whether it's wildfires or resiliency or reliability data, outages, energization. So we were only able to come up with this estimate going to the end of the year based on an advice filing that PG&E made last Friday. We don't have a complete set of advice filings from either Edison or San Diego, because they haven't done it yet. They'll do it, probably sometime this month. So if you do like a Google search, or kind of even a casual look to find out what's going on with rate increases, or use ChatGPT, you will get an inaccurate response, because they don't know. But what they do know, or what that Google search or ChatGPT or whatever will pick up, is announcements by the CPUC or the utilities about what they say it's going to be. It's not a completely accurate piece of information. So this is, as far as we know, very accurate for the last 2 years, and gives you a sort of a snapshot of it. If you go to the next slide, the consequences of PG&E's higher rates is that there's a cascading set of studies that are now indicating that grid defection, meaning that you no longer really need to rely on utility power in PG&E service territory, is starting to become quite likely plausible and economically viable. So this sort of identifies several reports, even going back up to 2019, and a Lawrence Berkeley Lab study looking at this issue. What the meaning of this is that, of course, not everybody is going to grid defect or leave the grid. Some people will partially do so. You do have to have capital assets to be able to get off the grid. You have to be able to buy whatever it is, solar plus storage or whatnot, in order to effectuate grid defection. So it's not for either the faint of heart or those that don't have a good financial capacity. That obviously suggests that those who do grid defect are the wealthier, more likely to be businesses and residents to leave. If this does become a feature, then it pushes what used to be called this utility into what might be called a death spiral, that it then puts the burden on paying for the remaining system on the remaining ratepayers, who again would more likely be low income, or certainly residential, a bit of small business. Not happening yet, but there's some troubling signs pointing to it. I guess a silver lining here is that what we're starting to see, for whatever reason, is that there could emerge an actual marketplace for energy in a way that hasn't existed ever. So that, you might actually have true choices to whether you want to be with a utility or with your own system, or maybe with aggregated systems. Not quite here yet, but certainly emerging quite quickly. And it's something that the politicians are paying attention to. This kind of thing is probably in part what's behind the governor's worries about affordability, and wanting to kind of start to manage that a little more effectively. I think I have one more slide to discuss, and that has to do with just equity. It's not really, again, a surprising thing. There's been a recent study that indicates that gas stations are more equitably located than EV charging stations nationwide. That's not a California look, but nationwide. Not really a shocking finding, and given that how slowly EV facilities are emerging and how historic gas stations are quite often, obviously, in lower income neighborhoods, so they're more accessible. It's not historically been seen as a good thing, but it's now becoming a thing in terms of how do you equitably roll out an electric future, including the necessary charging stations, in a way that is convenient and accessible to a host of demographics and income groups. I mean, the irony here is that an EV charging station would be way preferable in your neighborhood than a gas station. But on the other hand, if you can't fuel your car, then you want to have a gas station. So with that, I have that's all I have. I welcome comments, including, you can go back up to Mark's question on risk. It seems like the level 4 people are still around. So if we want to have any chat with them, they're here to talk. So please, comments, questions, observations, or I guess we can go to announcements. And I'll give it over to Kelsey.
Okay, well, if anybody has any questions for either Stephen, please speak up. We've got a very silent group today. I don't think we have any particular announcements. Oh, except that next month's regulatory call is currently scheduled for December 25th. So that's not going to work. So we're probably going to move it to the week before. So be on the lookout for that. And I know a lot of people have been struggling to get, they're like not getting the calendar invite, or it's not updated correctly. I think it's because it's like coming through a listserv, and it's a very big list. So I'm not quite sure what's happening there. I'm going to try and figure it out. Or maybe we'll just do like instead of recurring meeting, I'll just do a single meeting. Maybe that's the problem. Anyway, I'm going to try and figure it out, I promise. And unless there's any other announcements from anybody on the call, I think we can end a little early.
I do want to raise a question to the group if people want to comment. My partner Richard is available to appear on the December regulatory meeting if people want that. What's people's sense? Do they want to hear more about the cost shift debate, and hear more about his specific analysis and how people are reacting to it? Or I guess give a thumbs up or comment or something, give a signal of some kind if you do, or we know we don't need to do.
I definitely want to see that. I mean, it's really of increasing importance, especially as we go out and try to defend energy programs and as rents are growing. To be able to speak through that and have some talking points around it. It's one thing to point to the report and say, oh yeah, that report was the one that, but if you're in a conversation or having a dialogue, I think unpacking this helps our understanding of being able to, have that debate with somebody that's really on the other side of it. So I think it would be important. And it's a very significant report. I mean, in my mind, this should displace the SB 695 analysis. I mean, it should take that kind of weight, and it's that important. And I think that what we'll see in the regulatory or in the legislative session as we kind of enter into the lead up to February and the bill introductions, is that this is just gonna, if we thought last year was tough, next year's gonna, in just California alone, in the legislature is gonna be really tough. Not to mention everything else. So that's a long way of saying yes.
Any other positive or negative feedback on that idea for December? People are just checked out, ready for Thanksgiving. I guess. All right, well, I think it's a great idea too. And Pam also agrees.
Yeah, and I see Felicia's comment there. And just the whole risk part, and just once again, thanks for jumping on the call and giving that presentation. I mean, as the commission is trying to apply risk to these large immediate issues, wildfire, affordability, investment, Stephen talked about cost of capital. I mean, what risk is there of like spending money to help people that has 8 times the benefit of what we put into it? I mean, we apply that logic to ratepayer programs. It'd be like a zero risk investment. I don't see where decision makers' heads are at sometimes.
I mean, one thing around risk, I think, as was said by Matthew at the beginning of his presentation, it's kind of in the eye of the beholder. It's almost philosophical, and politicians have zero risk tolerance, right? They don't want to have any risk. And there is this kind of, in the terms of the outage proceeding, we are confronting a mythology or an assertion of reality that the utility is supposed to and does provide the same reliable level of services across customer classes and geographies. We know that's not the case. It's obviously not the case. And analytically, the utilities know it's not the case. But there's kind of a pretense in the regulatory space that we need to protect that level of reliability universally, even though we're not protecting it now, which makes it hard to have a conversation, a policy conversation about making choices. Right? Like what is our risk? Is our risk tolerance different? Different, it is, but are we willing to admit and act upon different risk tolerances based upon customer type, geography, resiliency, ability to have redundant power systems? It's the kind of conversation, and it does get to even Felicia's comment about how do we even understand risk. We need to confront the fact that risk is a diverse thing, both in terms of its presentation and our response to it. And then what are we gonna do about it, right? So we're gonna introduce that, some of that in the outage proceeding, but I fear that it will not be welcome because it's too hard of a topic to politically discuss.
Okay, great. So we will be sending out an updated calendar invite for the December one. And we're hoping that Richard can join us. I think there's a lot of agreement on that. And everyone, I hope you have a wonderful Thanksgiving, and we'll see you back around next time.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.